Alright, hello everyone, this is just a quick help video. So, we are inside of Afterglow because I got a bit of a help request asking about some compositor related issues with creating a scene with Afterglow lighting assets. So I said for Afterglow V2 I was having a problem where my renders were coming out brighter than the viewport. Deactivating the compositor in post-processing got me a more accurate result. The question is it better to activate the compositor for the viewport or deactivate it in the render? Is the difference on purpose or an oversight? Thanks. Okay, so it'd be nice to know specifically, the help request mentioned that when the compositor was deactivated in post-processing, it got more accurate. But does more accurate mean completely accurate or just a slight difference, like when compared to the viewport? They do show me a couple of pictures with the compositor having it on, which is brighter and off. All I really know is where to turn it off using compositor during render. I'm not sure I know any of the actual settings for the compositor are. Every time I use Afterglow, I load the blend file I've downloaded and then save that. Okay, I've got a note to make about that. I've made some tweaks to the position of the emissive panels you created, but as far as I know, I haven't touched the bloom effects. Right, okay, a few things to keep in mind. First of all, when using Afterglow, the actual folder structure that you download, I believe it's specifically the zip file, contains a subfolder called Afterglow V2, and this is an asset library, right? So you would have downloaded this. This is intended to be used as an asset library from the asset browser, meaning that if there's anything you want to drag in, like a studio cage, you can just straight up do that. If you want to, and as you are doing, you can just open the Afterglow blend file that's extracted and modify it from here, but it means that if you make changes to the content to reset it back to how it was, you would have to re-download the file again. So you just got to be a bit careful about that. But again, it's your file. After you purchase it, you can do whatever you want to it, and it will always be there to re-download. So when it comes to things being different in the viewport and render, the first thing to consider is your viewport or outliner visibility settings. Now in the top right up here, these aren't all enabled by default. Actually, I believe I've had to enable some of these. So you see these different icons here. You go viewport and the render buttons. Pressing the render toggle, which is this camera icon, won't do anything in the viewport because that is deciding the visibility of the objects in render. So one thing about Afterglow that you might find confusing, this is why you need to pay attention to the outliner, is that some light objects are visible in the viewport and some are not, but that visibility is not connected to this visibility as such. It's actually connected to the object visibility, ray visibility settings. Technically, I'd like them all like hidden by ray visibility, but I leave some on just as a bit of a guide. The bottom line here is that if you have light producing objects in the scene, even if you can't see all of them, double check that the viewport and render toggles are identical. So if you've got the viewport off, turn the render off. And if you've got the viewport on, turn the render on. And if you can't see all of these icons, press the filter button up here and you can toggle the visibilities here. If you hover over them, they'll tell you disable in render, disable in viewport, etc. So that's the first thing to consider, that it's a little bit confusing, but yes, every light object has its own kind of unique visibilities. 1 with the ray visibility, 2 with the viewport, and 3 with the render. So you may have an extra light object somewhere in the scene that's only visible in the render, and that might be why when you're rendering, the result looks brighter. So the next point was about compositing. So there used to be a problem in older versions of the file and Blender where we're having different like kind of bloom fog glow sizes, which fog glow is basically your previous way of making bloom before bloom was an actual option. The actual size of the bloom would appear different in the viewport compared to the render for some reason. Now things have moved over to this new bloom method. However, if you're using an older version of the file, then it may have like an older version of the bloom. So if you are using the glare node in any way, make sure it's on bloom, but also experiment with just using the straight up image output and making sure that the render looks the same light-wise as the viewport, because it really should. If it's just the image plugging into the image output, then make sure they're identical. If the render output is identical to the viewport with, again, just the image plugged in to the output, then you know that any lighting changes on top of that are compositor related because it was identical by the time it reached the viewport. However, if you, again, don't have any of this processing going on, right, any of this extra blooming, and the result is still different, so the render looks different to the viewport despite the fact that it's just outputting it straight away, then you'll know that it's not the compositor and there's probably something else going on. Now, the person that submitted this little help request did show me some render settings, I believe. Okay, so let me show you. If I make like a UV sphere, put it somewhere in the middle, it's not completely centered, let me give it the PBR material, and let's render this out. And I'm just gonna bring up the image editor down here so we can do a quick comparison. It took longer to render than it should have done because I am also recording at the same time. So one thing to note, the subdivision is different because in the modifier, we've actually got the render level set differently to the viewport. So again, just keeping in mind that these values can be separate. It's just the render output passing to the output of the compositor. I can disable and enable it, but we can see that as I do that, the lighting is identical between the two. If I take my denoised output, then it's slightly denoised and the lighting has not changed. And then if I do the bloom, the lighting has not changed, but the bloom is weak in this case. So I can turn it down, but notice that as the bloom is applied, then the lighting feels like it changes. Okay, so from low, or nothing rather, to higher bloom. In this way, if you've managed to isolate that it is relating to like blooming in the compositor, try turning up the threshold and understanding what these specific values do. So I'm going to do something a bit more with that. So if I plug the scene image into the bloom directly, and now in the viewport, I'm going to enable the compositor in the camera. That means we'll get a kind of live version of what's happening. And it's also applying this like to the final rendered output. So interestingly, we can see that as I change the values in the viewport and the compositor for the rendered version, they are pretty much the same. In fact, if I just up the resolution and render that again, so here we go, we should get a more accurate result. So now changing those bloom values, they're going to try and match each other. So really just a step through that, you just got to think about it like kind of debugging in some way. First of all, check your visibilities, make sure that they are uniform for the objects. Understand that in the visibility section of the object info in the properties, that the camera ray visibility is its own visibility marker for seeing things, which is distinct from hiding in the viewport or the render. Thirdly, isolate whether the change in lighting is before the compositor, or rather before any effects applied in the compositor, or afterwards, just by, playing around with the outputs. And of course, disabling using nodes and enabling will help you identify that. And then from there, if you know that it is compositor related, you can build a new node system and work from the default values of those nodes, which may be more appropriate. Because it's quite often easy to get lost in like changes that you've made to things like the threshold and not know exactly what they're supposed to be. And if there is still for some reason a difference in the lighting, despite the fact that you've kind of figured everything out or checked everything, then I would say do a clean test with a new blend file. So a completely empty blend file, viewport and render. And then if that's normal, then you'll know that it's the file you're using that's producing a weird output. But if that's also abnormal, then you'll know that it's probably not the file, but it is Blender or the GPU in some way, which would be a really weird issue. But also, like I said, Afterglow is intended to be used as an asset library, accessible from the asset browser. So, it's oftentimes nicer working from a completely clean file that you can just drag stuff in and out of, because you'll know that the stuff you're dragging in does not include compositor settings or trees or whatever that might mess things up. So it's just a few things to think about, but hopefully you can find your way through all of the properties in Blender. I understand that it can be a bit confusing, but again, let me know if you still have any issues. And hopefully this is useful to anyone else who finds it as well. So thank you, and I'll see you next time.